Superheroes are a big part of the comics, and it's what a lot of people think about when they think about comic books. I want to talk about them and horror comics. Comics come out of tradition of 1920s and 30s pulp novels where there were various adventurers, various crime fighting of different kinds. Also was publishing for kids, kids heroes, Tom Swift, who often invented things to solve a problem, and Nancy Drew for girls. So kids wanted literature, adults wanted literature that had stories to tell, often stories about good and evil. So 1940s is what they call the golden age of comics. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster came up with Superman, arriving from another planet as a baby, adopted by a farm couple, and using his superpowers for good. Shortly after, Bob Kane developed Batman, who didn't have superpowers but was very, very skilled and struck fear into criminals' hearts with his bat costume. You had other heroes coming up. Captain Marvel, here's the Marvel family, but very comparable to Superman, Flying Man. And during wartime, Captain America. And Wonder Woman. Fighting the Nazis and the Axis powers. Will Eisner developed the Spirit, is an urban crime fighter as well. So that was when a lot of the heroes that you still see making money in the movies today were developed. Even though you look at some of those old comics and they're pretty creaky, they seem pretty formulaic at times. Now, World War II had a big effect on everybody, and in the United States, it had an effect not only generating comics that were two-fisted and fighting the enemy, but the effect of the horrors of war, the horrors of the concentration camps, and the atomic bomb, the threat of the atomic bomb after the war, when other nations, Russia soon had access to it. So there was a sense of fear, there was a sense of sadness, anxiety in the United States, and so some horror comics made use of that. The EC Comics, originally the company was Entertaining Comics or Educational Comics, and it actually began with Bible stories. But it soon had comics about war, frontline combat, drawn by Harvey Kurtzman, who we'll talk about as a comics theorist later. Comics about crime. These were quite controversial because they're often very violent. Then horror comics. Tales from the Crypt. Haunt of Fear. The Vault of Horror. All these tales introduced by Crypt Keeper, Witch, or Vault Keeper. Now, a lot of this was because the artists and writers, many were Jewish Americans, and they might be second generation, their parents having come over turn of the century when there were pogroms in Russia and Ukraine, and a lot of Eastern Europeans came to the United States. But these guys had relatives who died in the concentration camps. And so they had a real sense of injustice and what life could be. So that inspired a lot of their writing, their morbidity. Of course, there's a whole American tradition of ghost stories, the Headless Horseman and Edgar Allan Poe's stories, and in the 19th century after the Civil War, a lot of spiritualism, trying to contact the dead. So it fit in that old tradition as well. They also excelled in science fiction, weird science. This cover was done by Wally Wood, who, I have a theory that he was this mediocre artist until about 1950 or so, and then the early 50s. Flying saucer must have flown over and irradiated him and gave him great talent, because all of a sudden you see these really well done black and white compositions with great shadows and great muscular figures and curvaceous ladies and just very skillful comic book art. He's a name that I want you to remember, Wally Wood. He had a very tragic life. He drank himself to death. He blew out his liver, causing great pain, and killed himself. We have a biography of him in Zano, if you want to read more. I think you might even say that the comics of all kinds have a moral basis behind them. There's a sense of right and wrong, good and evil in the heroes, superhero comics, crime-fighting comics, but also in the horror comics, that evil is compensated. That evil is dealt with, and there is revenge upon the evildoer. One of the horror comics has a butcher selling tainted meat, and a little boy is served it and dies. And the final scene has his mother in the butcher shop, and her eyes are glazed, and she's saying, "Tainted meat, anybody?" And you see in the glass butcher's showcase the butcher chopped into pieces being sold as tainted meat. So there is horror, but there is this resolution at the end. Even political cartoons, you think they have a sense of right and wrong, that the politician is being called into account, and the absurdity of what he or she is doing is brought to attention. So moralism might be something that runs through the comic medium in general. Now, even though I think these comics are among the most excellent produced in the U.S., I have a lot of reprints of them, not originals, and they're still reprinted. You can find them in comic book stores, the EC Comics. There was a great controversy at the time about juvenile delinquency, and do comics and their depiction of crime and decapitations and so on contribute to the youth delinquency. And so there were hearings held in Congress. And publisher William Gaines was called up to testify for Congress, and he didn't take it too seriously, which they didn't like. Other comics publishers, led by the guy who published Archie comics about healthy teenagers, came up with the Comics Code that had to be rigidly followed to have properly moral comics that didn't have things that were too suggestive and criminal that could lead youth astray. And that pretty well got rid of all of EC's titles, except for one. Their comic that parodied other comics and movies called Mad. Now, the 1950s were followed by, regarding superheroes and heroes, what was called the Silver Age of comics in the 60s. And that's the one I grew up with. And there were war comics like Sergeant Fury, character now played by Samuel Jackson, but he had a squad of fighters, various fighters. Fantastic Four, and very richly, ornately done, drawn. Here a medieval traveler, Prester John. Tells of all the places he visited. The mighty Thor, a god from Norse legend, returned to Earth to fight crime, to fight interplanetary attackers, so on. As I said, these were drawn by Jack Kirby, who many call the greatest comic book artist who ever lived. And he developed many of these with Stan Lee, who's still alive, who's still raking in a lot of money every time there's an Avengers or X-Men movie. And unfortunately, there was a break between the two before Kirby's death, because Lee wasn't returning original artwork, so Jack could cash in on the collector's market. In some cases, they may have actually disposed of it. Comics were churned out so quickly in those days that they didn't think to keep the original ink work and paste up with the text. But there are people who are very critical of Stan Lee because of that, though I think both need to be credited at having created a great bunch of superheroes that live on to this day. In the mid-60s, there was realization that college students were reading comics. Esquire magazine had a special issue on the Marvel comics that were suddenly the hit, or that had become the hit around campus. And comics weren't just being read by the subliterate, but they were so well written. They were these entertaining read for very intelligent people by this point. And there was a pop song, Sunshine Superman, that named a lot of comic heroes. And there was the Batman television show, made on a pretty low budget, If you look at some of it, it'll look pretty cheesy, but it also had fun effects of having noise balloons popping up in the middle of the fight scenes, so on. And a lot of celebrities wanted to guest on Batman because it was the hippest thing of the time. And you can imagine how it excited it like a 9-year-old like me. So the modern age, they start at almost 30 years ago. Maybe there's new designations since. The Dark Knight series, reinventing Batman, and Tim Burton's Batman movies drawn from them. A darker, more psychologically troubled hero. Image Comics, making use of advances in printing technology, not the flat color and Ben-Day dots of a grid of dots to make color, different colors that had previously been the inexpensive publishing process of comics, but higher resolution, glossier paper. These comics seemed very strange to me when I first saw them about 20 years ago, because I had grown up on the flatter, lower resolution comics. So, it's a long history. There are a lot of names, but hope that is an introduction to your lifelong study and engagement with the field and inspiration for your own comics.